The morning mist hovered like a thin shroud over the fields, blurring the fences and muting the distant clatter of ranch life waking up. In that hush, when the sun's first rays just touched the tips of the valley grass, an 11-year-old boy named Ben Palmer stood at the edge of a wooden corral, unmoving, as if rooted to the earth itself. He didn't speak. He didn't make a sound. The only sign he was even alive was the white mist of his breath, rising and vanishing with each quiet exhale. His hands were shoved deep into the pockets of a faded denim jacket, one sleeve stitched at the elbow with blue thread that didn't quite match. His eyes, too old for his age, focused on the animal standing a dozen yards away inside of the corral. The mustang was a striking chestnut, his mane almost black in the dawn's light. He was all lean muscle and nervous energy, ears flicking every time a crow called from the fence post or the wind rattled the gate chain. This was Dakota. The locals called him wild, untamable, a spirit born of the hills who refused the bridle and the human hand. They said he'd kicked down fences, snapped lead ropes, and tossed off every trainer who dared approach him with a rope in their hand or a treat in their pocket. But Ben didn't carry a rope. He didn't even have an apple, just a battered sketchbook pressed flat against his chest like a shield. He watched, barely blinking, as Dakota watched him right back. And time seemed to hang, suspended. The sounds of ranch life, boots on gravel, a pickup door slamming, the distant bark of dogs, stayed far away, respectful of the quiet at the corral's edge. The fog made everything softer, but the tension between boy and horse was sharp as barbed wire. Somewhere nearby, the gravel crunched and the shadow stretched across the fence. Hannah Whitaker, her hair pulled back under a battered Stetson, leaned on the top rail. She watched the boy, watched his stillness, the way he blended into the hush instead of trying to break it. She didn't call out. She just let her gaze flicker between the kid and the mustang, her breath a slow cloud in the cool morning air. "Don't waste your time, kid," came a voice from the barn, rough with sleep and skepticism. "That horse doesn't let anyone close, not even Hannah." Ben didn't answer. He just pressed his palm against the rail, as if reassuring himself the world was still there, solid and real. Dakota's ears flicked forward, then flattened, and his hooves shifted in the muddy straw. In the house at the top of the slope, curtains twitched. Someone, probably Ben's grandmother, Ruth, was watching too. She'd only taken Ben in a month ago, after the fire that took his parents and his home, and she didn't know what to make of his silence, or the way he'd become obsessed with the ranch's horses. Every morning, before the ranch was fully awake, Ben slipped out the back door and down the path to the corral. He never tried to touch Dakota, never even tried to climb the fence. He'd just stand there, sometimes for an hour or more, not saying a word, not moving. As some mornings he drew in his sketchbook, quick, nervous lines of hooves and eyes, manes flying, or sometimes just a shadowy outline with no face at all. Today, though, Ben just stood and watched, as if his gaze alone could bridge the gap between wildness and sorrow. Inside the corral, Dakota gave a soft, uncertain snort. His muscles bunched, ready to bolt, but he didn't move. He stared at Ben, eyes dark and alert, as if trying to read a message written on the boy's skin. Hannah watched them both, her jaw set, but her eyes softening just a little. She'd seen every kind of horse and every kind of kid in her 40 years of ranch life. But this was different. This wasn't the stare-down of two creatures fighting for dominance. It was more like, she couldn't quite say what, like two castaways meeting on the shore of something neither of them could name. She reached for the latch on the feed room door, her hands stiff from too many cold mornings, too many broken dreams. She knew what the others said about her soft training methods, about how she'd lost her nerve after that accident 3 years back. But she was still here, and so every day was Dakota, unbroken, untamed, and some said unfixable. A low rumble echoed from the barn. Clarence Mays, Hannah's longtime rival, laughing with two young hands over a mug of black coffee. Hannah's cheeks burned. She didn't need to hear what they were saying. She knew every line by heart. The valley was full of men who thought only force could shape a Mustang's soul. She'd made her mistakes, sure, but she believed in patience, in trust, even if it meant being the butt of their jokes. She watched Ben for another minute, debating whether to shoo him away or let him be. The boy was an enigma, traumatized, yes, but stubborn as any Mustang. The other kids at school teased him for his silence, for the way he always drew horses instead of people. Some of the teachers said he was troubled, but Ruth swore he was just grieving, just lost. Dakota pawed at the dirt, then, as if making a decision, lowered his head until his nose was almost level with the ground. Ben didn't flinch. He barely seemed to breathe. And in that moment, as the fog thinned and the first real light struck the corral, something shifted, a silent understanding, a kind of truce. For a heartbeat, it was just the two of them, wild and wounded, and waiting for someone to believe in them. Voiceover, soft, reflective, almost a whisper. They called Dakota untamable? But this boy wasn't trying to tame anything. Somewhere inside himself, Ben felt something loosen, a knot of fear or grief he couldn't say. He let out a breath, slow and steady. And Dakota's ears flicked again, as if in answer. The sun rose higher, chasing away the mist. Hannah straightened, her decision made. Let the boy have his quiet. Let the horse have his watcher. Some bonds, she thought, are built in silence. And in that silence, the story of the wild Mustang and the silent boy began to unfold. The sun had fully climbed above the valley by the time Hannah Whitaker trudged across the yard, boots leaving prints in the dew-wet grass. The quiet spell of dawn was breaking. Now came the noise of a ranch springing to life. Chickens scattered from her path. A battered Ford rumbled to life by the equipment shed, and the scent of strong coffee drifted through the open kitchen window. But the only sound Hannah really heard was the laughter echoing from the big barn, each guffaw laced with mockery and warning. Inside, Clarence Mays leaned against a hay bale, arms crossed over his chest, boots polished to a shine, no real rancher bothered with. His cronies, two younger ranchers from neighboring spreads, laughed along as he spun another story about Hannah's old-school methods, the ones he claimed were as outdated as her saddle. "You still talking to your horses, Whitaker?" Clarence called when he spotted her in the doorway, a slow, smug grin spreading beneath his salt-and-pepper mustache. "Maybe if you sang him a lullaby, Dakota would finally let you saddle him?" The others roared. Hannah's cheeks flushed, but she refused to look away. She'd known Clarence for decades, back when he was just another cocky hand and she was the new girl trying to prove herself in a man's world. Now he owned half the valley, always sniffing for a sign of weakness. "You got a better idea, Clarence?" Hannah asked, her voice steady, even if her heart beat double time. "Because your boys didn't have much luck with him either." Clarence's eyes narrowed. "I never waste my time on lost causes." Hannah shrugged, masking her frustration with a forced smile. "Good thing I'm not looking for easy wins." As she turned to leave, Clarence called after her. "Heard you got yourself a new helper, that mute kid from Ruth's place. Maybe he can talk some sense into your Mustang." Hannah ignored the jab, though it hit home. The ranch had always been her refuge, a place where her patience was a virtue, not a punchline. But lately, the whispers around town had grown louder. Everyone knew she was struggling. The pastures were patchy, her best hands had moved on, and her reputation rested on Dakota, a horse nobody could handle, least of all a woman nearing retirement. Outside, Hannah paused at the corral fence, watching Ben. He'd settled into the same quiet pose as always, Dakota mirroring his stillness. There was something almost sacred about the way they existed together, neither demanding nor retreating, just breathing the same morning air. The ranch dogs barked at the gate, announcing the arrival of more ranchers, neighbors come to watch Dakota's next episode, and secretly to see if Hannah would finally admit defeat. Among them was Mary Lou Jennings, her arms folded tight, eyes sharp as flint. "You really gonna keep at this, Hannah?" Mary Lou asked, not unkindly. People are talking? I know what they're saying, Hannah replied. They said the same thing when I trained Cloud Dancer. Remember him? Mary Lou nodded, but her face softened. That was a long time ago, hun. Hannah bristled. I haven't forgotten how to listen. But the doubt crept in, cold and persistent. She couldn't shake the sense that everything was on the line. Not just her pride, but her whole way of life. Clarence, with his big money and bigger mouth, was circling like a buzzard. That afternoon, the valley's main road buzzed with pickups as word spread. Hannah was bringing Dakota into the round pen again. Clarence stood at the top rail, arms folded, his eyes bright with anticipation. Dakota tossed his head, snorting, hooves flashing as Hannah entered with nothing but a coiled rope at her side. No whip, no shouting, just the quiet presence that had served her well with other horses. Until now. The horse's muscles quivered. For a long moment, he circled the edge, sides heaving, eyes wild. Hannah whispered soft encouragements, every movement careful and measured. She tried to channel calm, to show Dakota she wasn't a threat, but each time she stepped closer, he flinched away, sweat darkening his chestnut coat. From the stands, Clarence called out, Maybe he just doesn't like your perfume, Whitaker. A ripple of laughter. Hannah grit her teeth. The sting was sharper this time, because part of her wondered if Clarence was right, if her time was up, if the valley was changing, leaving her behind. As the session dragged on, Dakota grew more agitated. He reared once, pawing at the air, then spun away from the rail and charged for the gate. Hannah barely dodged aside, heart hammering, as Clarence's voice rang out again. Face it, he's a lost cause. Sell him to the rodeo, before you break your neck. The crowd's energy shifted. Some shook their heads, others muttered among themselves. Hannah knew the optics were bad. The harder she tried, the more the mustang fought. The more the mustang fought, the more her critics gloated. Finally, breathless and shaking, she signaled for the session to end. She met Dakota's eyes, wild, hurt, afraid. Her own reflected the same. As she left the pen, Clarence approached, slow and deliberate, with all the showmanship of a gambler sensing weakness. Tell you what, Hannah, he said, voice dropping to a stage whisper. Let's make it interesting. I'll give you till the spring festival to break that horse. If you can't get him under saddle, I get the north pasture. A hush fell. The north pasture was prime land, her father's legacy, the last buffer between her ranch and Clarence's creeping empire. And if I do, Hannah shot back, her pride flaring even as fear curled in her gut. Clarence grinned. Then I'll shut up for good about your methods. Maybe even call you the best damn horsewoman in the county. The challenge hung in the air, heavy as a summer storm. Deal, Hannah said, sticking out her hand, voice steady even as her insides trembled. Clarence's grip was hard, almost cruel, but Hannah matched him squeeze for squeeze. Around them, the crowd murmured, the lines drawn. As dusk settled, Ben remained by the corral, watching Dakota. The mustang was quieter now, pacing less, but still wary, haunted by his own ghosts. Hannah approached Ben, studied his face for a sign. Any sign, but the boy just stared into the twilight. You think I can do it? She asked softly, voice barely audible. Ben's eyes flickered to hers. He said nothing. But something about the way he stood, firm, unyielding, beside the wild horse, felt like an answer. In the failing light, Hannah squared her shoulders. The bet had been made. Her legacy, the land, maybe even Ben's silent hope, all riding on the impossible. But for the first time in weeks, as the boy and the mustang faced the coming night together, Hannah felt the faintest glimmer of belief. Tomorrow, she would try again. And this time, she wouldn't be alone. Spring mornings in the valley could be deceptive. Sometimes the sun blazed, hot by midday. But today, there was still a bite, as is in the wind. A memory of frost in the deep shade. Ruth Palmer stood by her window, arms crossed tight as she watched her grandson Ben disappear down the dirt road, alone again. He always left before breakfast, No matter how many times Ruth tried to coax him to eat, he'd just shake his head, grab his battered backpack, and slip away like a shadow. She worried about him. Everyone did. The neighbors whispered that Ben was troubled, not just because he'd lost his parents, but because he didn't speak. Not a word, not since the fire. Even the school counselor had called, suggesting therapy, special classes, a move to town. But Ben refused to go. His eyes, gray as winter rain, always drifted toward the fields and the distant shape of Hannah's ranch. That morning after Ben had left, Ruth went to tidy his room and found the reason why. Drawings. Hundreds of them, some loose leaf, some in sketchbooks, others scribbled on napkins and brown paper bags. Horses, galloping, grazing, wild-eyed, gentle, every shape and mood. The only people in the drawings were small, distant, half-hidden, always overshadowed by the horses. But the one drawing that struck Ruth most was a picture of a boy in a chestnut Mustang, standing on opposite sides of a fence, both looking lost but somehow hopeful. Meanwhile, Ben made his way down the winding road, his boots crunching on gravel, the early chill stinging his cheeks. He kept his eyes low, counting steps, skirting puddles, focused on the familiar ache in his chest. He'd lived in the valley before, his mom grew up here, and Ruth's house was full of memories. But now, after the fire, nothing felt the same. He was a guest in his own story. His backpack, heavier than it looked, carried his most precious things, pencils, erasers, a handful of worn sketchbooks, and one battered spiral notebook. The notebook wasn't his, it was his mother's. She'd kept it all through his childhood, jotting down thoughts on horses, training notes, sketches, even little poems. He carried it everywhere, clutching it when the memories threatened to drown him. He didn't know why he walked to Hannah's ranch every day. Maybe it was the way the air felt cleaner there, the way the horses moved with their own wild purpose, untamed and beautiful. Maybe it was Dakota, the mustang who never let anyone close, except sometimes. Just for a moment, Ben. As he rounded the last bend, Hannah's ranch came into view. It wasn't much compared to Clarence's spread, but to Ben, it was a kingdom. Weathered barns, fences patched and mended 100 times, paddocks full of promise and heartbreak. Horses grazed in the pasture, tails flicking, manes rippling in the breeze. And always at the far end, the corral where Dakota waited. Ben didn't ask permission to visit. He just slipped under the fence, careful not to spook the horses, and found his usual spot outside Dakota's pen. He settled on the ground, cross-legged, and pulled out his sketchbook. The Mustang watched him warily at first, then, recognizing the boy, lowered his head and relaxed. Just a fraction, Hannah noticed, though she pretended not to. She was mending a bridle nearby, her eyes hidden under the brim of her hat, but she watched Ben and Dakota out of the corner of her eye. She'd seen plenty of so-called horse whisperers, but this was different. Ben didn't use treats, didn't try to approach, didn't make a sound. He just existed, quiet and patient, in the Mustang space. Sometimes when she caught a glimpse of his sketches, Hannah's breath would catch. He captured Dakota's essence in a way no photograph could. Strength, fear, wildness, longing. Sometimes she wondered if Ben was drawing the horse or himself. The ranch hands noticed, too, their curiosity tinged with skepticism. "Kid's weird," one of them muttered. "Never talks, just sits there, creeps me out." "Maybe he's got a gift," another replied, watching as Dakota stepped closer, nostrils flaring. By midday, word had gotten round that the Palmer boy was spending all his time at Hannah's place. At the diner in town, folks speculated. "Poor Ruth," they'd say. "She's got her hands full. Kid's just not right after what happened." But the rumors didn't stop Ben. He showed up every day, rain or shine, always quiet, always patient. Sometimes, when no one was looking, he'd open his mother's notebook and trace the faded words with his finger. Trust is built in silence, not with force. A horse's heart isn't conquered, it's invited. He didn't know what he was looking for, not exactly. But in the hush of the corral, with Dakota's steady gaze on him, Ben felt a tiny spark of hope, like maybe he wasn't as broken as everyone thought. One afternoon, as clouds gathered on the horizon, Ben noticed a piece of the fence was loose. He knelt to fix it, hands working without thinking. Dakota moved closer, his breath warm on Ben's shoulder. For the first time, Ben let himself smile. A small, quick thing, gone as soon as it appeared. Later, when Hannah passed by, she paused and studied the fence. "You fixed this?" she asked. Ben nodded. She looked at him for a long moment, then handed him a small, battered horseshoe. "For luck," she said, then walked away. Ben tucked it in his backpack next to his mother's notebook. That night, Ruth tried again to get Ben to talk. She made his favorite dinner, mac and cheese burnt at the edges just how he liked it, but he only picked at his plate. "I know you miss them," she said softly, voice thick with her own grief. "But you've got a home here. You always will." Ben looked at her, eyes shining, but said nothing. In his room, surrounded by sketches, Ben opened the notebook one more time. He wrote in the back a message he hoped his parents might hear, wherever they were. "I found a horse that's like me. Everyone says he can't be fixed, but maybe he doesn't need fixing. Maybe he just needs someone to sit with him a while." The wind rattled the windows, and Ben closed his eyes, listening to the night. In the darkness, he dreamed of running, free and wild, beside a chestnut mustang. No words, no fences, just the open sky. And when morning came, he rose before dawn, grabbed his backpack, and set out for Hannah's ranch, drawn, as always, to the one place where silence felt like hope. The valley woke slow and golden, sunlight streaming over the hills, touching the fields with promise. Hannah was already up, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold, her mind busy with worry and hope in equal measure. She glanced through the kitchen window and saw Ben sitting cross-legged outside Dakota's pen like he did every morning. There was something about the way he sat, still, gentle, expectant, that made even the wildest horse pause. Dakota stood in the center of the corral, muscles taut but calm, eyes never leaving the boy. For weeks, Hannah had tried every method she knew, talking, coaxing, letting Dakota run until his lungs burned, but nothing had worked. He refused the bit, the rope, even the gentlest touch. But Ben, he didn't offer anything, no treats, no tools, just presence. Some days, Dakota snorted and pawed at the dirt, ears flicked back, but Ben never reacted. He didn't flinch when the horse charged the fence in frustration. He didn't turn away when the Mustang bared his teeth. He just breathed, slow and steady, eyes fixed on Dakota as if listening to a story only they could hear. Hannah watched from the porch, remembering her early days on the ranch, when her father told her, "You can't break a horse that's already been broken by the world. You have to show him the world can be gentle too." She'd forgotten that lesson somewhere along the way, lost it amid all the years of hardship and competition. Now, seeing Ben and Dakota, she wondered if maybe she could find her way back. One crisp morning, as Hannah made her rounds, she spotted something sticking out of Ben's backpack, left near the fence. She picked it up carefully, thumbing through the weathered pages of a well-loved journal. The handwriting was feminine, looping and sure. Training notes, sketches, memories. At the front, an inscription, "For Ben, may you always find the wild in your heart." Hannah closed the notebook with a lump in her throat. It was his mother's. Now she understood. The boy wasn't just silent from grief. He was silent because that notebook held all the words he wished he could say. That evening, as the sun slipped low and the sky glowed orange, Ben returned to the house, dirt on his knees and charcoal on his hands. Ruth waited for him on the porch. "You're making a habit of this," she said, trying to sound stern, but her eyes soft. Ben just gave a small nod, clutching his backpack tighter. Inside, over a quiet dinner, Ruth hesitated, then asked, "Do you want to talk about the horse?" Ben stared at his plate, picking at peas. He shook his head. Ruth reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You don't have to say anything. I just want you to know I'm proud of you." That night, Ben dreamed of running beside Dakota, grass whipping at his legs, the wind singing in his ears. No fences, no fire, no loss. Just freedom. In the dream, his mother watched from the hilltop, smiling, the notebook in her hands. The next day, as the sun climbed, Ben was at the ranch even earlier. He sat by the fence, sketchbook open, drawing Dakota's powerful lines and wild eyes. For the first time, the horse didn't shy away. He edged closer, nose stretching toward the boy. Their breaths mingled in the morning air. Hannah saw it all. She didn't interrupt, didn't shout instructions. She just watched, arms folded, heart full of questions. In Ben's presence, Dakota wasn't the wild, dangerous beast the valley believed him to be. He was simply searching. As days passed, Ben's quiet became a kind of invitation. He hummed soft, tuneless melodies under his breath, not words, but gentle vibrations that seemed to calm Dakota. When Hannah checked on them, she found the boy reading softly from the notebook, her mother's notes about trust and patience drifting into the morning light. Sometimes, Ben would close his eyes and just listen. Birds sang, cows called in the distance. But all he cared about was the rhythm of Dakota's breathing, the scrape of his hooves, the snort of his nose. Each sound told a story. Each silence meant trust. Ranch hands started noticing the change. "That Mustang's different with the kid," one whispered to another, "like he knows something we don't." Hannah nodded, but said nothing. She felt the shift, too, not just in Dakota, but in herself. She stopped pushing so hard, started listening more, remembered the softness that first drew her to horses, before pride and rivalry and the need to prove herself to men like Clarence. One afternoon, as clouds rolled in and thunder threatened, Ben was the only one who didn't run for cover. He stayed with Dakota, crouched low in the shelter of the fence, humming as the rain began to fall. The horse stood nearby, unafraid, his sides quivering, but his eyes calm. Hannah rushed out with a slicker, trying to pull Ben away, but he shook his head, stubborn as ever. So she sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder, rain soaking them both. They stayed that way until the storm passed. Dakota grazing quietly nearby, comforted by their silent company. When the rain finally stopped and the rainbow arched over the fields, Hannah laughed for the first time in weeks. It felt like something old and precious returned to her at last. Later, as she helped Ben wring water from his jacket, she whispered, "You're teaching me as much as that horse ever could, kid." Ben looked up, surprised, and for a split second a shy smile flickered across his lips. Word began to spread through the valley. The wild Mustang wasn't so wild anymore, at least not with the Palmer boy. Some folks called it luck. Others called it magic. Hannah knew better. It was neither. It was trust, built in quiet moments, one heartbeat at a time. Clarence, hearing the gossip, grew restless. He watched from a distance, eyes narrowed, plotting his next move. But for Ben and Dakota, there was no plan, no scheme, just presence, just the steady, patient work of healing, the kind that happens not in loud victories, but in silent, steadfast companionship. And in that stillness, a broken boy and a haunted horse began, at last, to find their way home. The valley felt different as spring deepened, lush, alive, and yet, for those who listened closely, threaded with tension like a wire strung too tight. The rumors about Ben and Dakota had become the talk of the town. Folks came by Hannah's ranch just to catch a glimpse of the boy sitting quietly at the corral, Dakota standing close, ears relaxed, as if the stormy Mustang had found his anchor in a silent child. Even the most skeptical neighbors had to admit something was changing, but the whispers carried something else too, a warning, low and persistent. It was well past midnight when Clarence Mays parked his truck at the edge of the property. He killed the headlights, slipped on a battered old hat, and pulled his coat tight against the chill. The moon was a thin sliver, barely enough light to see by, but Clarence didn't need much. He'd worked this land as a boy, and he knew every shortcut, every weak fence post, every trail through the tall grass. He moved quickly and quietly, tools clinking in his pocket. He stopped at the north fence, Hannah's best pasture, the land at stake in their bet. He crouched low, hands rough from decades of ranch work, and searched until he found a section of fence already sagging at the base. He grunted, pulled out a pair of heavy-duty cutters, and snipped through the wire in 3 clean motions. The gap widened enough for a horse to slip through, but not enough for anyone to notice at a glance. Clarence stood and surveyed his work, face hidden in shadow. "No harm done," he muttered. "Just a little reminder the world's not as gentle as she thinks." He melted into the darkness, careful to leave as little trace as possible. At dawn, Ben was already up, backpack slung over his shoulder, shoes half-tied, hair wild from a restless night. He walked the familiar road, sketchbook in hand, humming a barely there melody that echoed in the early morning stillness. He reached the ranch just as the sky blushed pink, dew soaking the grass, and the world silent except for birds and the distant lowing of cattle. He paused when he saw the open gate, the corral empty. Panic stabbed at his chest. Dakota was gone. Ben ran, lungs burning, eyes wide with fear. He searched the paddocks, the trails, every hiding place he knew. He called out, his voice rusty from disuse, hoarse and shaky. "Dakota! Dakota!" Hannah heard the commotion and rushed out, her boots thudding across the porch. She spotted Ben, wild-eyed, scanning the fields. "What's wrong?" she shouted. "Dakota, he's not in the pen?" Ben's words tumbled out in a gasp, the first he'd spoken on the ranch since arriving. Hannah didn't pause to celebrate. She grabbed her coat, called for the hands, and started searching. They spread out, combing the pastures, voices ringing out across the fields. Minutes stretched, hearts pounded. Ruth, having heard the shouts, joined them, worry written deep on her face. "He wouldn't run far," she insisted. "He always comes back for Ben." But Ben shook his head, fear rising like floodwater. What if something scared him? Just then, a low whinny echoed from the far end of the field, the side nearest the broken fence. Ben took off running, feet barely touching the earth, hope and dread tangled together. There, just outside the gap in the fence, stood Dakota. He wasn't running wild through the valley or disappearing into the hills as everyone feared. Instead, he waited, head down, tail swishing, as if he'd been expecting Ben all along. Ben stopped a few feet away, breathless. He met Dakota's eyes, uncertain but not panicked. Ben reached into his bag, pulling out his mother's notebook, and whispered, "I'm here." Dakota stepped forward, nostrils flaring, and pressed his nose against Ben's shoulder. The boy didn't move, didn't even blink, just stood steady, holding on to the only thing in the world that made sense. Hannah arrived, with boots splattered with mud, and saw the two together. She knelt, inspecting the fence, her eyes narrowed as she spotted the clean cuts, the way the wire curled back unnaturally. It was no accident. She looked up at Ben, who was stroking Dakota's neck with trembling hands. "Someone did this," Hannah muttered, voice tight. "Someone wanted Dakota gone." Ruth's voice, as sharp with fear and anger, cut through the silence. "Who would do something like this?" Ben didn't answer, but his eyes darted toward the road, the direction Clarence's truck sometimes idled in the evenings. Headlights off, waiting. The suspicion felt like a cold stone in his stomach. They brought Dakota back to the corral, hands gentle, voices low. Ben stayed by his side, refusing to leave. Even when the adults urged him to rest, he leaned against the fence, drawing in his sketchbook. Every line a lifeline, every curve a promise. "I won't let you go." Word spread quickly. By noon, the town was buzzing. Some called it a miracle. Dakota returning instead of running wild. Others called it a sign. Some muttered that Ben's presence was unnatural, that no mustang could be trusted, especially one that had tasted freedom. A handful of old-timers shook their heads in wonder. "That boy's got something about him," one said. "That horse could have run clear to the Rockies, but he came back for the kid." But not everyone believed in miracles. Clarence, sitting at the counter in the diner, heard the news and scowled into his coffee. All luck runs out, he muttered. Sooner or later, that mustang will show his true colors. Back at the ranch, Hannah found hoof prints, deep, circling the fence line, evidence of Dakota's confusion and hesitation. She found the cut wire, showed it to Ben, and said, "This wasn't just a coincidence. Someone's trying to mess with us. But I promise, Ben, we're not going to let them win." Ben nodded, lips pressed tight, determination flaring in his eyes. That night, after Dakota had been fed and the fences checked and rechecked, Ben sat outside the corral under a sky full of stars. Ruth joined him, blanket draped over her shoulders. "You did good today," she whispered. "You kept your promise." Ben looked at her, eyes bright with pride and fear and something like hope. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. And inside the house, Hannah scribbled in her own notebook, her hands shaking. She wrote about trust, about sabotage, about the cost of believing in what others called impossible. She watched Ben through the window, sitting with Dakota, and wondered if maybe, just maybe, they were both learning to trust again. As the valley slipped into silence, the warning lingered in the air. Danger was close, but so was something stronger, something born not of force, but of steadfast, stubborn love. And in that fragile peace, boy and horse found each other once more, both haunted, both healing, both waiting for the dawn. The first signs came quietly, a stumble in Dakota's usually confident gait, a subtle dip of his head when Ben arrived that afternoon, a faint tremor running through the mustang's flanks as the sun began to sink behind the hills. Ben noticed immediately. He had grown attuned to every nuance of Dakota's body language, every flick of his tail and twitch of an ear. Today, something was wrong. He stood by the fence, sketchbook forgotten in his lap, watching as Dakota picked at his hay without enthusiasm. The horse's breath came heavier than usual, his chest rising and falling with silent effort. When Ben softly called his name, Dakota barely lifted his head. Worry gnawed at Ben, sharp and insistent. Hannah, busy with the evening chores, didn't see the change at first. Only when she came to the corral with fresh water did she spot the sweat darkening Dakota's coat, the sluggishness in his step. "He's off," she murmured, frowning as she ran a hand down Dakota's neck. The skin was hot, far too hot. "Something's wrong," Ruth came out, concern etched in her features. "What is it?" she asked. "Fever," Hannah replied, voice tight. "And a bad one." Dakota shuddered, swayed on his feet, and nearly collapsed. Ben's heart hammered as he slipped into the pen, ignoring the adult's protests. He reached Dakota's side and laid a tentative hand on the mustang's quivering shoulder. Dakota didn't shy away. Instead, he leaned into Ben, eyes clouded but trusting. "I'll call a vet," Ruth said, voice shaking. Right now, the call was made, but help would take time. The valley's only large animal vet was on another emergency, 2 hours away at best. As dusk deepened and a cold wind swept across the fields, the sense of urgency in the ranch grew palpable. Every shadow seemed longer, every sound sharper. The sky threatened rain. Inside the barn, Hannah and Ben worked together to settle Dakota on a thick bed of straw. Hannah draped a heavy blanket over the Mustang, her hands gentle but brisk. She brought buckets of cool water, urging Dakota to drink, but the horse only sipped, head drooping. "Come on, boy," Hannah whispered. "Stay with us." Ben refused to leave Dakota's side. He curled up next to the horse, knees drawn to his chest, the soft light of a lantern casting golden halos around them. He pulled out his mother's notebook and began to read. Quietly, each word more for himself than for anyone else. He read about patience, about hope, about how even the wildest spirit could heal, if given enough time. The hours crawled by. Hannah came and went, checking Dakota's pulse, wiping sweat from his flanks, whispering reassurances she didn't quite believe. Ruth brought food, but Ben barely touched it. At midnight, the fever seemed to break through a new threshold. Dakota groaned, muscles twitching, nostrils flaring with shallow breaths. Ben's fear threatened to swallow him whole, but he wouldn't look away. Instead, he reached for his sketchbook, hands trembling, and began to draw. He drew Dakota strong and proud, mane flying, hooves striking the earth, everything the Mustang was before sickness stole his fire. Rain began to patter against the barn roof, first a soft murmur, then a relentless drumming. Hannah returned with sleeping bags, a thermos of cocoa, and a quiet resolve. "If you're staying, then so am I," she said. "We'll keep watch together." The barn became a world unto itself, shut away from the cold and fear beyond its walls. Ben hummed soft lullabies he only half remembered from childhood, letting the rhythm soothe both himself and Dakota. He whispered stories about wild horses running free, about second chances and new beginnings. At times, Dakota seemed to listen, his breathing slowing as Ben's voice filled the night. Other times, the horse's head drooped lower, eyes glazed, sweat pooling beneath him. The hours passed in a blur, nervous checks, whispered prayers, the unending chorus of rain. Hannah dozed lightly, head against a hay bale, boots still on. Ben stayed awake, fighting sleep, fighting dread. Determined not to miss a single moment. Around 3 a.m, the barn door creaked open, and the vet finally arrived, coat soaked, eyes tired but alert. He knelt beside Dakota, checked vitals, shook his head. High fever, dehydration. I'll give him fluids, something for the pain. After that, it's up to him. The vet worked quietly, hands sure, injecting medicine, soothing Dakota's shivering frame. Ben watched every movement, hope flickering in his eyes. When the vet was done, he squeezed Hannah's shoulder. "He's a fighter. Keep him warm. Talk to him. Sometimes that's all you can do." As the vet drove away, taillights vanishing into the night, the barn fell silent except for the wind and the slow, labored breaths of a horse in pain. Ben crawled closer to Dakota, spread his sleeping bag beside the Mustang's head, and lay down. He whispered into the darkness, soft and steady, telling Dakota all the things he wished someone had told him. "You're not alone. I'm right here. I'm not leaving." Hannah pulled her own sleeping bag close, offered Ben a cup of cocoa, and listened to the quiet hum of his voice. For the first time in a long while, she felt a kind of peace, painful and fragile, but real. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the barn, a different kind of courage took root. Not the loud bravery of heroes, but the quiet, stubborn endurance of those who refuse to give up, even when hope feels thin as mist. Morning crept in, pale and uncertain. Dakota's fever had not broken, but he was still breathing, still fighting. Ben, eyes red and heavy, kept his vigil, humming lullabies as the first light brushed the barn walls. The ranch was silent, the world holding its breath. But within those walls, boy and horse faced the darkness together, not with words, but with the unspoken promise that neither would face it alone. Dawn broke quietly over the valley, washing the hills in gentle gold, but inside Hannah's barn, the hours crawled as slow and heavy as winter mud. The night had been endless. Dakota's fever still burned. Ben had barely moved, eyes fixed on the Mustang's ragged breathing, the boy's voice raw from whispered lullabies and silent prayers. Hannah, half dozing on a hay bale, started awake at the soft nudge of Ruth's hand. "You need rest," Ruth said gently, but Hannah shook her head. "Not yet. Not until he's out of danger." The vet's words haunted her. After that, it's up to him. She replayed every moment of her career, every victory and every mistake, and wondered if she was holding on for Dakota, or for herself. She looked at Ben, his small frame curled beside the sick horse, lips moving in a soundless promise. Something in that stubborn silence made Hannah's heart ache with an old, familiar hope. The barn was quiet, except for the rhythmic drip of rain outside and the slow, labored breaths of the Mustang. A single sparrow flitted through a crack in the roof, perched on a beam, and watched the strange family below. As the gray morning turned to pale blue, Ben sat up suddenly. He dozed off for just a moment, chin on his chest, but a subtle change in the barn's energy drew him back, something different in Dakota's posture, the faintest movement in the Mustang's head. Hannah noticed too. "What is it?" she whispered. Ben crawled closer. Dakota was struggling, muscles trembling as he tried to rise. For a moment he seemed ready to collapse, but Ben's presence steadied him. The boy whispered, "You can do it," his voice trembling but full of faith. With a shaky grunt, Dakota braced his hooves, pushed against the straw, and slowly, painfully, rose to his feet. Hannah felt her breath catch, tears stinging her eyes. "Attaboy," she murmured. "You did it. You really did it." Dakota stood, head low, sides heaving, but his eyes were clearer now, his legs steadying beneath him. Ben stroked his muzzle, smiling through tears. Ruth pressed her hand over her mouth, silent with relief. The vet returned mid-morning, not expecting much. When he stepped into the barn and saw Dakota standing, he stopped short, a grin breaking through his fatigue. "Well, I'll be damned," he said quietly, kneeling to check the horse's heartbeat. "This kid, he never gave up on him. That's what made the difference." Hannah nodded, voice thick. "Neither did that horse." The news spread faster than a prairie fire. Neighbors heard that Dakota had survived the night, thanks to Ben, thanks to the stubborn, round-the-clock watch in Hannah's barn. Some who'd doubted before now showed up at the ranch, bringing offerings, fresh hay, hearty soup, handwritten notes wishing Dakota's strength. Even some of Clarence's hired hands stopped by, dropping a bag of oats and muttering, "He's a tough one, that's for sure." Their pride wouldn't let them say more, but their gestures said enough. By midday, the barn was crowded. Mary Lou Jennings brought her famous chicken stew and stayed to help clean stalls. The Miller twins from the next ranch over arrived with apples for Ben and carrots for Dakota. Hannah found herself surrounded by faces she hadn't seen in months, folks she thought had written her off. For a moment, as she stood in the sunlight spilling through the barn door, Hannah understood. This was what she'd fought for, not just to prove herself, but to keep the spirit of the valley alive. It was about community, about refusing to let hardship drive them apart. Clarence, hearing the commotion, appeared at the edge of the crowd, arms folded. He didn't step inside, but his eyes narrowed as he took in the scene. The old rivals gathered, the boy and the mustang at the center of it all. He caught Hannah's eye and smirked. "Lucky break," he called. "But don't think one sick night means you've won." Hannah straightened, chin up. "Luck had nothing to do with it, Clarence. It's about not giving up." Clarence shrugged, but the edge in his voice was gone. Maybe even he was starting to believe. Ben, exhausted but proud, sat beside Dakota, quietly sketching the mustang's face. He barely noticed the grown-ups or the noise. He was lost in the world he and Dakota had made, where silence was safety, and every breath was a victory. As the afternoon faded, people drifted home. The barn quieted, the horses settled, and Hannah finally sat beside Ben, shoulder to shoulder. "You did something?" "I couldn't," she said softly. "You gave him a reason to fight. You taught me how to listen again." Ben looked up, eyes shining. For a heartbeat, Hannah thought he might say something, but he just nodded, and that was enough. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, the ranch felt lighter than it had in months. Ben hummed a gentle tune while Dakota grazed on fresh hay, every muscle less tense, every movement less labored. Hannah leaned against the barn, arms folded, pride warming her chest. Ruth stood at the gate, hands clasped. She called out, "Soup's on!" And for once, Ben didn't hesitate. He ran to her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and for a moment, the sorrow and silence of the past felt like something they could leave behind. Later, as darkness fell, Hannah sat on her porch, watching the last light fade. She felt the fatigue in her bones, but also something stronger, a fierce gratitude for the community that rallied, for the boy who never gave up, for the mustang who refused to surrender. In the barn, Ben lay curled in his sleeping bag, Dakota's breathing slow and steady beside him. The boy whispered, "Thank you," voice barely more than a breath. And though the horse couldn't answer, Ben felt the warmth of his presence, the soft nudge of a velvet nose, and knew they'd both survived something bigger than fever and fear. Outside, the wind carried a promise of brighter days, and inside, hearts that had once been broken found the first fragile threads of healing. Together, against the odds, in the quiet company of trust. Spring had always meant more than green grass and warm rain in the valley. It meant the annual Spring Festival, when ranchers and townsfolk came together to celebrate the changing seasons, to show off the best of their stock, their baking, their music, and, most fiercely, their horses. This year, the festival's buzz was sharper than ever. Rumors swirled about Hannah's high-stakes bet, about the wild Mustang and the silent boy, about whether the old ways or New Hope would win the day. The festival grounds brimmed with color and energy. Flags fluttered along the main fence. Tents bustled with vendors hawking lemonade and pies, and children wove through the crowd in boots too big for their feet. Near the arena, the air was thick with the scent of fresh hay, horse sweat, and anticipation. Loudspeakers crackled as the announcer listed events: barrel racing, team roping, Liberty class, the grand parade. But everyone's whispers kept circling back to the final showdown: Clarence Mays and his show horse versus Hannah Whitaker's Mustang, ridden, not with a saddle, but in the hands of a silent boy. Ben barely noticed the noise. He stood with Dakota at the edge of the fairgrounds, one hand on the Mustang's shoulder, heart pounding in his chest. Hannah, dressed in her best pressed shirt and boots, squeezed his arm gently. "You don't have to do this," she murmured, voice trembling. "We can back out. I'll take the heat." Ben shook his head. He met Hannah's eyes, steady and brave. His lips parted. He wanted to say thank you, to say he was scared but ready, to say Dakota wasn't just a horse, but the piece of himself he thought was lost. But in the end, he just nodded and turned back to his friend. Dakota was ready too. The Mustang's coat gleamed, eyes bright and alert, mane braided loosely to show off his wild beauty. He wore no saddle, no reins, just a soft rope draped across his neck as a token. Ben's pockets held only a single sugar cube, a secret promise for after. In the grandstands, the crowd buzzed with excitement and skepticism. Some folks, especially the old hands, said it was crazy, maybe even dangerous, to let a boy and a barely trained Mustang loose in the arena. Others whispered that something special was happening, that maybe, just maybe, the valley would witness a miracle. Clarence made his entrance first, sitting tall atop a gleaming bay gelding named Blue Ribbon. The horse was a marvel, every muscle toned, every movement sharp and precise, the product of years of expensive training and daily drills. Clarence tipped his hat to the judges, jaw tight, eyes flashing as he caught sight of Hannah and Ben. "Show 'em how it's done, Blue," he muttered, and the gelding performed an elegant dressage step, earning a ripple of applause from the stands. When Clarence finished his routine, tight turns, flawless canter, a perfect halt, the announcer called for the next entry. And now for the Liberty class. Hannah Whitaker's Dakota, with young Ben Palmer. The world seemed to shrink as Ben led Dakota into the arena. At first, the Mustang hesitated, ears flicking at the roar of the crowd, the glare of the overhead lights. Ben took a deep breath, steadying himself and his horse. He pictured the quiet mornings by the corral, the endless nights in the barn, the feel of Dakota's heartbeat against his palm. He let that memory lead him. He raised his arm, a signal Dakota knew well by now. The Mustang trotted forward, head high, his gait full of unbroken power. Ben walked a slow circle in the sand, Dakota mirroring his every step. With a gentle wave, Ben invited him to canter, and Dakota obeyed, circling wide, mane streaming like a banner. The crowd watched, silent at first, unsure if they were witnessing a miracle or a disaster in the making. Then Ben stopped and lifted both hands. Dakota, untethered, untamed, came to a perfect halt at the boy's feet. Ben turned, and Dakota bowed, lowering his head nearly to the dust. There was no command, just trust, a language built in hundreds of shared silences. The arena filled with whispers, then with gasps as Ben ran a few steps, Dakota following close behind, their movements in perfect harmony. At a signal, Dakota reared, not in fear, but in a gesture of pride and joy, as if saying, "I am here, and I am free." The final test came as Ben crouched low and Dakota trotted a wide arc, then came back, stopping inches from Ben's outstretched hand. Ben pressed his forehead to the Mustang's, both boy and horse breathing together, the world beyond the fence falling away. The silence shattered as the grandstands erupted. Cheers, whistles, applause so loud it rang against the hills. Hannah wiped tears from her cheeks. Ruth's hands clapped so hard they stung, and even a few old-timers stood in their seats. The judges conferred, looking stunned. One, a grizzled rancher who'd never given Hannah much credit, leaned in and said, "I ain't never seen anything like that. That ain't training. That's something else." Clarence stood in the shade, arms crossed, face dark. He tried to laugh it off, but the sound fell flat. He watched as Ben and Dakota took a slow victory lap, the boy's face lit with a quiet, shining pride. As they left the arena, children rushed to the rail, asking for a closer look at Dakota. Ben let them stroke the Mustang's neck, whispering gentle encouragement. Hannah joined them, squeezing Ben's shoulder, voice thick. "You did it, kid. You both did." Ben reached into his pocket, took out the sugar cube, and pressed it into Dakota's mouth. The Mustang lipped it gently, eyes soft, and Ben finally let himself smile. At the edge of the crowd, Ruth hugged Hannah tight. "I knew you could do it. I just knew." As the sun slipped low and the festival's music swelled, Ben stood with Dakota, watching the last light fade over the hills. The valley was changed somehow. Quieter, braver, full of new hope. That night, as the festival wound down and the lanterns glowed, the story of the silent boy and the Mustang who wouldn't be tamed spread through the valley, a story of faith, trust, and the unbreakable bond between a child and a wild soul. The spring festival lingered in the town's memory, long after the lanterns were packed away and the laughter faded. Ben and Dakota's performance became the talk of the valley. Neighbors told and retold the story, each time with new details, as if they'd all witnessed the moment when trust and hope trumped fear and pride. The old-timers called it a turning point, something the valley would remember for years. But beneath the celebration, everyone remembered the wager. For weeks, the fate of Hannah's north pasture, the best land she owned, hung in the balance. Clarence, stung by public humiliation, but clinging to pride, tried to insist that the festival was a fluke, a show trick, not a real measure of horsemanship. He cornered the judges, argued with the festival committee, even spread rumors that Hannah had somehow cheated, that Ben was just a lucky charm. Yet the judges stood firm. "We've never seen anything like it," the head judge said. "That's what this valley is about. Heart, not just muscle." The committee met at the Grange Hall, listened to townsfolk on both sides, and announced their decision. Hannah Whitaker had won. She kept her land. The news hit Clarence like a kick to the gut. He stormed out of the Grange Hall, boots scuffing the floor, not even pausing to tip his hat to the ladies on the porch. For years, he'd plotted to claim that pasture, always assuming he'd outlast Hannah, that old ways would win out. He hadn't expected a silent boy and a Mustang to shift the tide. But Hannah's victory didn't bring the reaction anyone expected. The morning after the announcement, she walked her land alone, boots wet with dew, the weight of years pressing down on her shoulders. She looked out over the rolling grass, the fence lines patched and mended by her father's hands, the wildflowers nodding in the breeze. It was beautiful. But something had changed. At the kitchen table, over black coffee and Ruth's biscuits. Hannah called a meeting. Ben sat quietly, Dakota's halter in his lap, as Ruth sipped her tea. "I've been thinking," Hannah began, voice steady but soft, "about what comes next. This ranch, this land, it's always been about more than cattle and fences. My dad taught me that. He said we're just caretakers for a while. We hold on, and then we let go." Ruth looked up, concern in her eyes. "You're not talking about selling?" "No," Hannah shook her head. "Something better." She pulled out a folded sheet of paper, a legal document stamped and signed. "I've set up a trust," she said, voice growing stronger. "I'm turning the North Pasture into a Mustang sanctuary. Not just for Dakota, but for every wild horse that needs a second chance. No one Not Clarence, not the bank, not even me, can ever sell it or break it up. It belongs to them now, and to kids like Ben, who see what most folks miss. The silence was heavy, then full of stunned awe. Ruth reached out, squeezed Hannah's hand. Ben stared at the document, his heart thundering with something too big for words. Outside, the sun broke through clouds, lighting the pasture in gold. For the first time in years, Hannah felt free. Free of rivalry, free of fear, free to do what she'd always wanted. She didn't need Clarence's approval, didn't need the valley to call her the best. She had found her purpose, and it was rooted in kindness. Word spread fast. The valley's reaction was mixed. Some praised her vision, others called it foolish, a waste of prime grazing land. Clarence, learning the news, was furious. He drove up to the ranch in his old truck, jaw clenched, eyes dark. He stormed up to Hannah on the porch. "You're throwing away your future for a bunch of useless horses after everything you fought for?" Hannah met his glare without flinching. "It's not throwing away anything, Clarence. It's giving back. You want to leave a mark on this valley? Try leaving it better than you found it." Clarence sputtered, fists clenched, but the fight had gone out of him. The crowd that gathered watched, silent, as the two old rivals stood toe to toe. Finally, Clarence spat in the dirt, turned on his heel, and stormed away. The sound of his truck engine faded down the road, and with it the last shadow of his threat. Later that day, Hannah gathered the ranch hands and neighbors by the pasture gate. She invited Ben to cut the ribbon on the sanctuary, his hands shaking as he held the big silver scissors. Dakota stood beside him, calm and proud, as if knowing something important was happening. The ceremony was simple. No speeches, just a quiet walk along the fence line. Kids and horses trailing behind. Some people brought apples, some brought wildflowers. Mary Lou played a tune on her old fiddle, the melody sweet and wistful. When it was done, Ben stood at the gate, watching Dakota lead a small band of rescued mustangs into the tall grass. For the first time, the boy spoke aloud. Voice soft, uncertain, but clear. "Thank you," he whispered. To Hannah, to his grandmother, to Dakota, and to the valley itself. He didn't say much more. He didn't have to. People lingered, reluctant to leave. Ruth hugged Hannah, whispering, "You did the right thing?" Hannah smiled, tears in her eyes. "So did he," she nodded toward Ben. That night, with the valley wrapped in twilight and the sanctuary quiet, except for the gentle sounds of horses grazing, Ben sat with his sketchbook on the porch. He drew Dakota, strong and free, running beneath the wide open sky. His voice, though soft, had begun to return. Sometimes he read aloud from his mother's notebook. Sometimes he sang little melodies as he walked the fence line. Each word, each note, was a thread tying him back to the world. Inside, Hannah and Ruth shared tea, watching the boy through the window. You think you'll be all right?" Ruth asked. Hannah nodded, watching Dakota graze, a foal trailing at his side. "He already is. They both are." The past was still there, grief, loss, mistakes. But now, so was hope. And for the first time, letting go felt like holding on to everything that mattered. The days grew long and warm, wildflowers waving in the breeze across the sanctuary fields. With the pasture safe and the valley at peace, the rhythm of ranch life settled into a new, quieter pattern. Yet, beneath that gentle surface, something profound was happening. Ben and Dakota, both changed by what they'd survived, were building a life shaped not by loss, but by hope. Morning started with Ben sitting on the porch steps, sketchbook open, Dakota grazing nearby, a small foal at his side, one of the first rescues born in the sanctuary. Hannah and Ruth, mugs in hand, would share quiet words, watching the world awaken. Sometimes, when the sun was just right, Ben's face would catch the light, and for a moment the boy who once seemed lost in silence was radiant. Eyes bright, lips turned up in a shy, confident smile. He spoke more now. The words came slowly, sometimes in a halting rhythm, but they came. At first it was simple things. a soft good morning for Ruth, a quiet thank you for Hannah after chores, or gentle words whispered into Dakota's mane as they walked the fence together. Then, gradually he found his voice for stories, the kind his mother had told him, the kind he had written in drawings all along. One afternoon, Ben sat beneath the old cottonwood by the north pasture, sketching the foal as it tumbled in the tall grass. A group of neighborhood kids wandered up, curiosity bright in their eyes. "Is it true you tamed the wildest mustang in the valley?" a little girl asked, clutching a daisy in one hand. Ben hesitated, then shook his head, smiling. "I didn't tame him," he replied, voice sure and gentle. "I just listened. He was already brave. He just needed someone to see him." The kids nodded as if Ben had told them a great secret, and soon they were asking him to draw their horses, their dogs, even imaginary creatures. Laughter echoed across the fields, and Ben realized that somehow he was part of this world again. Hannah, watching from the porch, felt a pride she couldn't quite explain. She'd spent her life fighting for her place in the valley, for respect, for land. But now, she understood. Legacy wasn't about what you kept, but what you gave away. The sanctuary was thriving. Horses, once battered and broken, now ran wild and free. The ranch had become a place where the quiet and wounded could find their feet, and just maybe their voices. Word of the sanctuary spread. Families came from neighboring towns, bringing horses in need of rescue, sometimes just to walk the fields and feel the peace that had settled over Hannah's land. Local teens volunteered after school, mending fences, brushing horses, learning the patient work of trust from Ben and Hannah both. Clarence, humbled but changed, came by once to drop off a load of hay. He didn't say much, just tipped his hat, scratched Dakota's nose, and left a crisp envelope on the porch, a donation in memory of a horse he once thought unworthy of the valley's best land. In his quiet way, he had let go of old grudges. One evening, as sunset bled orange and lavender across the sky, Hannah found Ben sitting on the fence, Dakota beside him, both bathed in golden light. The foal ran circles around them, legs long and clumsy, but full of joy. Hannah sat beside Ben, their legs swinging in rhythm. "You did something special here," she said, "not just for Dakota, for all of us." Ben looked at her, eyes shining. "You did too. You gave us a place to heal." They watched as the foal nuzzled up to Dakota, the older mustang lowering his head, gentle and wise. Ben thought of all the times he'd felt broken, all the days he'd thought the world had nothing left for him. But here, in this place of second chances, he understood that healing wasn't about forgetting loss. It was about finding something or someone to stand beside you in the silence. The summer stretched on, the sanctuary blooming with life. Ben's sketches filled the house, pictures of mustangs running wild, kids laughing, Hannah and Ruth sipping tea, Dakota and the foal silhouetted against endless sky. Ruth hung some on the kitchen wall, proud of every line and shadow. In the evenings, Ben would sit with her, reading aloud from his mother's old notebook, sharing the lessons she had left behind. Sometimes Ruth would cry, but always with a smile. On the first anniversary of the sanctuary's founding, Hannah hosted a picnic for the whole valley. Families gathered under the cottonwoods, sharing food and stories. Ben was asked to say a few words. At first he shrank back, nerves fluttering in his stomach. But when he saw Dakota standing calm beside him, strength flowed in. He stepped forward, voice clear and sure. "Sometimes the world tells you to push through pain, but I learned something from Dakota and from all of you. Sometimes healing means just being there, standing together, not asking for anything, just sharing the quiet, until hope comes back." The crowd listened, hushed. In that moment, everyone saw. Not a broken boy, but a leader, a storyteller, a bridge between the wild and the gentle. As the evening faded and fireflies blinked in the fields, Ben sat with Dakota and the foal at the edge of the pasture. He sketched by lantern light, the lines coming quick and free, Ruth and Hannah watched from the porch, sipping tea, hearts full. A gentle voiceover might have carried across the night. Soft and true. Ben never came to change a horse. He came to remember how to breathe. Dakota. He just needed someone who didn't ask for anything but trust. Some hearts don't speak through words. They speak through stillness. You don't heal grief by pushing through. You heal it by standing beside it. And sometimes the strongest bond is the one no one ever planned. Ben looked up at the stars, Dakota's breath warm beside him, the foal nestled close, and knew that home was not a place. It was a feeling, a promise, a new way forward.